Hello girls, today I'll be taking the chapter Does It Matter by Richard Leakey, and this is a very important essay, and this belongs to the fourth module, that is Environment Matters. Now this essay basically deals with the idea of biodiversity, the need to preserve biodiversity, and this is an essay by Richard Leakey. Richard Leakey is a Kenyan paleoanthropologist, conservatist, and politician and has held many official positions. He was the director of the National Museum of Kenya, the head of the Kenyan Wildlife Service, and the cabinet secretary and overall head of the Kenyan Civil Service. Leakey, he is credited with putting an end to the elephant slaughter in Kenya, making international news headlines with the burning of stockpile of that is 12 tons of ivory in 1989. Since 2002, he is a professor of anthropology at Stony Brook University, New York, and chair of the Turkana Basin Institute. He is also the founder of Wildlife Direct. It is a registered charitable organization established in 2004 to provide support to conservationists in Africa. In 2007, he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society London and was awarded the Isaac Asimov Science Award in 2013 by the American Humanist Association. So this essay, Does It Matter? It is the last of the 14 chapters in Leakey's book, that is The Sixth Extinction. The Sixth Extinction, this book was co-authored with Roger Levin. So this essay basically begins with a reference to the famous bet or wager between Simon, that is Julian Simon, and Paul Ehrlich. Now this wager or bet goes by the name Simon Ehrlich wager. And the wager or the bet basically represents two opposing views on the need to preserve biodiversity. You find that Paul Ehrlich, he is a biologist, and Julian Simon was an economist. So if you look at the wager, you find Paul Ehrlich believed that the effect of population growth would be catastrophic because each year the population seems to be multiplying by millions, and this is going to harm the resources, the natural resources available on the planet. So this is what Paul Ehrlich believed. Now Julian Simon, since he was an economist, he basically believed or he refused to believe what Paul Ehrlich said about population growth and how it's going to impact the natural resources. According to Julian Simon, he believed that human species, we are an ingenious species, and therefore we would have or we would come up with our own, we would come up with ingenious ways of coming with alternatives or solutions to loss of resources. So you find that the wager, it concerned the inflation adjust prices of five metals. So they undertook $1,000 bet, and that is in 1980. So now if over 10 years, the price of five metals, now they decided on a few metals like tin and copper and all that. So if by within 10 years the prices rose, then Simon would have to pay Ehrlich. If they fell, if the prices fell, then Paul Ehrlich would have to pay Simon. Now this was the bet. So this is the five metal basket of commodities. So you find that over what happens is after 10 years, the price of chromium, copper, nickel, and tin, instead of rising, it actually went down in price. So this idea of the population bomb or the idea that population growth and its diverse, its effect on the availability of resources was really not proved. At the end of 10 years, you find that the price of these metals actually went down. So this basically proved what Julian Simon was saying, what he was trying to say, that human species, we are an ingenious species, and we will come up with very creative ways to somehow counter the loss of resources or the availability of resources. We will be able to manage it somehow. So at the end of 10 years, what happens is Ehrlich had to pay the amount to Julian Simon. So this wager or this bet basically tells you about two opposing views on how people see the need to preserve biodiversity. Now, Richard Leakey, he elaborates on three important areas of the value of biodiversity. That is economic, ecosystem services, and aesthetic pleasure, and agrees with Leigh Kaufman that the loss of any species erodes the human soul. He further stressed the need to sustain ecological diversity, stating that our ignorance of the true nature of the input-output relations or interactions between species may lead to an erroneous assessment of their value in an ecosystem, causing irrevocable breakdown upon their loss. So now he agrees. You find Richard Leakey. He talks about three major areas of biodiversity that are of value. That is economic, ecosystem service, and aesthetic pleasure. And he believes what Leigh Kaufman says, that if any species, if there is a loss of any species, then you find it does something to the human soul. It does, in some way or the other, affect humans, whether directly or indirectly. Now, Leigh Kaufman is actually the author of Why the Ark is Sinking in the Last Extinction. You find Kaufman is an evolutionary ecologist and specializes in the biology and conservation of aquatic ecosystems. So he is a person who believes that all the species have to be protected, and he stresses on the need to sustain ecological diversity, because according to him, we do not know the world in its entirety, and we do not really know the true nature of the interactions between species. Therefore, because we do not know it correctly, we do not know the true nature, and because we are ignorant, then we can go wrong, and our erroneous assessment, or because we do not have a true or right judgment, we may make mistakes, and those mistakes will be insurmountable. Those mistakes cannot be corrected at all, because once we lose a species, that loss can never be made up. That is what he's trying to say. Now he says fossil records shows that there have been several unpredictable and irreversible crises of life. So he says, what if we make a mistake, if we miscalculate, uh, that miscalculation may end up creating crisis in life on the planet and species, and these crises, it will be irreversible. We will not be able to do anything about it. So he says, while evolution is powerfully creative process that has restored diversity after each prior mass extinction, however, this does not mean that one sentient creature on earth, Homo sapiens, should not be concerned about preservation. Now we have examples, we've had lots of examples, we've had 5 prior extinctions. Now each of those extinctions teaches one thing, and that is so-called natural diversity. Natural diversity, it is very creative. You find evolution. World continues, the planet continues to thrive after each extinction. But this does not mean that we should not be concerned about our own preservation. You find humankind, like all the other species, we do not have any claim for self-preservation. And because we are the one sentient creature, we have the ethical responsibility to protect the Earth's biota. Now, unlike the five previous extinction events whose causes are not determined, the sixth extinction in progress is a direct result of human activities. Now, the so-called previous five extinctions, we do not know the exact reason as to why those five extinctions took place. We can be certain about the sixth extinction. Now, Paul Ehrlich, he begins the essay with an analogy. Now, he says that just because ecologists cannot say precisely how many species are endangered, it is premature to be alarmed about the impending collapse of biodiversity. Now, there are a group of people who believe that ecologists are simply alarmed, over alarmed, or they are too premature in spreading their alarm about the threat to biodiversity because they have no proof. But then you find Paul Ehrlich says it's almost like saying um, people should not be concerned about the burning down the world's only genetic library because the number of books in it is not known to within an order of magnitude, and fire modelers disagree on whether it will be half consumed in a couple of decades or whether that level of destruction might take 50 years. So he says it's almost like saying that if there is, the world's genetic library, the world's only genetic library, if it catches fire, it'll be like saying, you know what, let us not worry about that library burning up because we do not know actually how many books there are. And we do not know the magnitude of the fire as to how long that fire is going to take to burn down the entire library, whether it will be consumed in a couple of decades or 50 years. Fire is fire. So he says it is almost funny to say, let's not worry about fire. Let us not worry about how long it's going to take. Because a threat is a threat, he says. And there are certain people, anti-alarmists. He calls this category anti-alarmists because they believe that people who cause or raise alarm are simply doing it for the sake of causing an alarm. I have my own analogy. Imagine that a giant asteroid is spotted on collision course with Earth. Now you find Leakey, he says, I have my own analogy to provide. He says, imagine that a giant asteroid is spotted on a collision course with Earth. Many people would be justly worried because such impacts are thought to have unleashed mass extinctions in the past. My reading of the logic of Julian Simon and his ilk here means his group of people or his followers, is that they would argue there is no cause for alarm because theories of mass extinction as a result of asteroid impact are pure speculation and guesswork. No one has ever seen such an extinction happen, and anyway, the asteroid might miss. So now Richard Leakey, he gives us his own example, he gives his own analogy, and he says, just imagine that a huge asteroid is seen. It's spotted on a collision course with Earth. So imagine there is an asteroid coming towards Earth. There is a chance of it hitting Earth. Many people like Julian Simon and his followers, they would probably say, you know what, that asteroid may or may not hit Earth. So far, there have been no guarantees. There is absolutely no base. There is no justification to such a theory that it will come and hit the planet. Therefore, there is no need for us to be worried. They would also say that there is a chance that the asteroid might miss, that it might never hit Earth. But he says, can we simply wait for the asteroid to be really close to the Earth? Can we simply wait and see if Julian Simon and people like him are correct? Can we take on such a risk? He says no. If there were some means of deflecting the asteroid, the cost of not doing so would be catastrophic. We cannot simply fold our arms and wait for the asteroid. And when it is really close to Earth, we cannot run around because then it would be too late. Just because if there is a threat, we have to do something about that threat. If there is a possibility, if there is a slight possibility of an asteroid even coming close to Earth, then we have to deflect it. At all means, we should take every measure to make sure that that asteroid is deflected. And that is the only way. He says, in case so-called idea of Julian Simon and his ilk turned out to be wrong because they belong to the group of anti-alarmists. They belong to a group, they believe that people simply raise alarm for no cause altogether. So he says, we cannot be very sure if it is an asteroid or if it is any kind of threat to our planet, we have to take actions immediately. Now imagine if Julian Simon and his followers are wrong about the sixth extinction. Now the sixth extinction, it is also called the Holocene extinction. And you find that the sixth extinction, it is an ongoing extinction. It is mainly due to human activities, but slowly we are getting there. So he says, what if Julian Simon is wrong? What if there is actually a threat and we are too slow and we hesitate to take action? By the time the threat is real, it will be too late. What would it matter to us and the rest of the world's biota if half its species were to be pushed into oblivion sometime during the next century? Just imagine, what if suddenly, what if within a matter of a couple of decades, what will happen if our ecology and our species are are pushed into oblivion? They become nothing, they're pushed into nothingness within a century. Now these are several answers to these questions depending on the time frame in which they are cast. One of them is that in the long run it matters not. He says, in the long run, it matters not. Now, the logic of Julian Simon and his group of followers, they believe we need not worry, we need not panic about things that may or may not happen. But you find Richard Leakey and people like Paul Ehrlich, they they justify and they try to explain to us why they are afraid for our planet's survival, because they understand the sixth extinction, since it's an ongoing extinction, it is a very real threat and we have to take steps immediately. So there are several answers to these questions depending on the time frame in which they are cast. One of them is that in the long run it matters not at all, although true in a sense, and many anti-alarmists adduce it in their support. So even though there are a lot of questions, there are a lot of different answers, a lot of what ifs, and then most of them, they say that after a while species, they do go extinct. So if species are definitely going to go extinct, what is the matter? Why would we worry about extinction? Because after all, nothing is permanent. So although this is true, he says, we have to we have to worry about our life, about human species, our role in society and in our planet. In chapter 8, I talked about the value In chapter 8, I talked about the value of biodiversity and identified three more important areas. So here you find, he says, preserving biodiversity, preserving the world's biota and its species. It's very important. And now he identifies three key areas of this biodiversity. One is economic, second is economic services, and aesthetics. So he says, I won't go into this in any detail again here, except to say that where value can be identified, it follows that the loss of diversity represents the loss of that value. So if you look at biodiversity, it provides three main benefits. So these are the benefits that humans gain from the environment. One is economic, one is ecosystem services, and the other is aesthetics. He says, I will not go into detail here, but we have to understand that when a particular species goes extinct, the loss that is associated with the extinction of that species, that too has to be taken into consideration. So now if animals and plants are a potential source of new materials, new food and new medicines, then the loss of species reduces the potential. So he says, if animals and plants, I believe you know more about what's possible. Like if you look at different forms of alternate medicine, they make use of plants and they make use of they take extracts from animals, and it is used for not just raw materials, but it is used as medicine, food. So we need animals and plants, and they are actually sources of food and medicine to humans. So when a particular animal or a plant they become extinct, you have to understand that potential. The loss of that particular species also suggests loss of potential of that particular loss as well. So you find that if an interacting network of plants and animals is important in sustaining the chemistry of the atmosphere and the soil, the loss of species reduces the efficacy. Efficacy is the efficiency of these services. So these are the services, and it is very important because one is connected to the other. And if a rich diversity of species succors the human psyche, so if a rich diversity of species, it supports and it aids the human psyche in multiple ways, then the loss of that species, it will reduce us. It would reduce us in some ineffable way. So you find most of these species, they support the human psyche in ways which we cannot really explain. And if that particular species goes extinct, then it would affect us in some indescribable way, he says. Now, a legitimate question in each of these three areas, however, is the following. Are all the existing species necessary for satisfying economic worth, ecosystem services, and aesthetic pleasure, or can some be lost without harm? So now this is one question that keeps popping up. Now, if our three main concerns are economic, ecosystem services, and aesthetic, do we need all the so-called species in this planet? Because not all species provide us with all these three key areas. So then can we lose a few species? Can we afford to lose a few species without causing harm to humans and to the planet? Now, this is one question that people keep asking, he says. To people like Julian Simon, the answer is obvious, and he displays it in reference to the loss of species that occurred when settlers clear cut the Middle West of the United States. Now, to people like Julian Simon, this is a simple question that has a very simple answer. So he says the answer is obvious to people like Julian Simon because according to Julian Simon, when settlers they cut down trees in the Middle West in the United States, it seemed hard to even imagine that we would be more enormously better off with the persistence of any such imagined species. He suggested in his debate with Norman Myers. So he has, he had a debate with Norman Myers, and he says that yes, when the trees were cut in the United States, you find that there were certain species that were wiped out, and it did not do much. This casts some doubts on the economic value of species that might be lost elsewhere. Now, Simon's principal measures of value are economic and immediate practicality, as illustrated by a further remark he made in the debate. So, Simon, of course, being an economist, he does not really worry about the loss of species. He is a very practical sort of a person, and all his principles, all his ideas are based on economics and practicality. So, what he says was recent scientific and technical advances, especially seed banks and genetic engineering, have diminished the importance of maintaining species in their natural habitat. So Julian Simon has a wonderful, I would say, a way out of loss of species. He says that we have storage, we store seeds, we have seed banks, and we have genetic engineering. Our technology is so advanced that we really do not have to worry about loss of species in their natural habitat. We can very well, genetically engineer animals and plants because we have the capacity. So we do not really have to worry about the extinction of any species. So Richard Leakey completely disagrees with him, and he says that I'll contrast this with a very different way of looking at the value of species in their natural habitat made by Leigh Kaufman in a chapter in his book The Last Extinction. Now you find even though Simon, he does not consider this to be a serious matter, what the loss of species. When the middle west of United States, when the settlers they they cut down trees. When they cut down trees, there was a huge loss. There were three species that were lost to humankind altogether, to this planet. And he talks about that. Now, Simon does not see that as a problem because according to him, after all, we have seed banks and genetic engineering. But now, Leigh Kaufman says a piece, a piece of the American soul died along with the passenger pigeon, plains buffalo, and American chestnut. Now he talks about three species that went extinct in the United States. And then he says that it is not a direct loss, but rather it is an ineffable loss or it is an indescribable loss. But you find the American, a small part of the American soul died with the extinction of these three species. You have the passenger pigeon, which went extinct, along with the plains buffalo, as well as the American chestnut. As you can see, American chestnut is a huge tree, as you can see over here. And this is the plains buffalo. They were hunted, literally hunted down. So although I would not argue that each and every species in the world must be saved, especially at the cost of maintaining human welfare, my sentiment is closer to Kaufman's than to Simon's. So Richard Leakey agrees with Kaufman rather than agree with Simon's point of view. He says humans evolved within a world of nature, and an appreciation of and need for nature are real and ineradicable components of the human psyche. So he says that we we were born into the lap of nature. We are part of this nature that created us, and therefore we are connected to nature, and nature is, it is an ineradicable component of the human psyche. And he says it is a danger. We risk eroding the human soil if we allow the erosion of the richness of the world of nature. If something happens to the biodiversity, if the world of nature is compromised, then we are compromising, or we risk eroding the human soul. But suppose the human psyche could be nurtured through the trauma. So he says, let us assume that a human psyche can be nurtured. We can treat it. We can somehow protect it through the trauma of an ecologically impoverished world. Imagine species end up dying and we do survive. What kind of life would it be? So he says that suppose to the present or future technologies could provide us with all the material resources that we presently and potentially derive from the natural world. Would we be able to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever growing population for the next 7 billion years, as Julian Simon contends? So imagine we lose the natural world, we lose species. He says, let us suppose that our technology, our future technology can provide us with all the so-called resources that we need and we might need in future. But is there any guarantee? Is there any guarantee that we would be able to feed and clothe and supply energy to the so-called population that seems to be growing every second, to the ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years? Julian Simon says, yes. Julian Simon believes in technology. He believes that with technology, man will survive, will not perish. But can we be certain? It is true that throughout human history, the material quality of life has steadily increased, even as the size of population has increased. Because as there is advancement in science and technology, human life, we need better life. Our lifestyles change and we demand more and more. And with the increase in the size of the population, the demand for quality of life increase in the material quality of life too has increased, and this will keep on growing. Now, guided by this history, Simon assumes that the same pattern can extend essentially indefinitely into the future, and that there is no limit to what humans can take from the world of nature without detriment to ourselves or to nature itself. Now, Simon believes that uh, he is an idealist, I suppose, of a sort. He believes that we can continue to lead our life as we want to. We can cut trees, we can pollute the world, and nothing will happen to the world. Simon assumes the same pattern can extend indefinitely into the future. He says we do not have to worry about anything because our technology will be able to protect us, and there is no limit to what humans can take from the world of nature. He says, or he believes, that humans can exploit nature. Humans can take whatever they want from the world of nature without harming ourselves or nature. That nature, of course, can always renew itself, revive itself, and we can continue to exploit nature. Nothing will happen, nothing will go wrong. In other words, he believes that our continued appropriation, that is, our continued claim and possession of nature, is compatible with sustaining an equable natural world. So he believes that nothing will go wrong. We can go on possessing and claiming and exploiting, manipulating nature, and nothing is going to go wrong. So now Richard Leakey says history is, of course, a useful guide to the future, but it can also blind us to emerging realities. Science and technology have increased our creature comforts. Of course, there is no doubt, but those creature comforts may blind us to the reality of the global environment. Nurtured as many of us are in our artificial urban environment, we do not see the relationship between the inputs and outputs of natural economy of the earth. So if you're looking at history, if you're looking at what has happened, it is a good guide, he says, what looking back into history, letting history guide us. But history will blind us to what is actually happening right in front of us. Science and technology has made our lives very comfortable, he says. Yes, there is no doubt about it. But these comforts have made us blind to what is happening, the critical problems that the global environment faces. Nurtured as many of us are in our artificial urban environment, we do not see the relationship between the inputs and outputs of the natural economy of the earth. So we are not attuned with nature. We have lost that balance, and this loss of balance has damage. It is damaging, it is causing problems to us. We do not see that happening because we are so comfortable in our urban environment. We lose insight about what's happening around us. Leakey here says that we do not actually see or we do not understand the inputs and outputs of Earth, that is of nature. We are not able to understand the interactions between species, that is from the filaments of fungi, which nurture the health of plant rootlets, that is the smallest, to to the cycles of water and oxygen. He says that you will not understand it completely, and he says that these are certain beneficial services done for humans. So these are ecosystem services, and he says this is what I referred to earlier, and he says that they basically represents the tangible elements of stability and health that emerge from the entire biota of earth operating at a complex dynamic system. So he says this biota is a very complex, it's a dynamic system, and we have a lot of I would say inputs and outputs, and there are a lot of things that we gain from this so-called system, dynamic system. So if we take anything out, that would be the end of that service. Now he says, how exactly do health and stability emerge? We don't know. So he says, like, if people are going to ask us, how do we get health and stability from this biota? He says, we cannot tell you. That is not something that we can be very specific about. Now there is another question: can the system, that is, can this biota be reduced in size through eliminating a proportion of species in all ecological realms and still be effective? So now that is another question that people have put forward. That is, can we reduce the size of biota? That is it possible that we can eliminate a few of these species and then still have this, I would say, this balance in biota? Is it possible? He says, we don't know. Which are its most important components? Now, which are the most important components of earth, of this delicate system, of this biota? He says we know this only incompletely. So if we are to eliminate or somehow reduce the size of this earth, this complex biota of earth, if you're planning to minimize it, we need to know which are the most important components and which are not. Now he says even this idea or this information is incomplete. We do not know which are the most important components and which are not. Which species or groups of species can be removed without detriment to the system that sustains us and all living organisms? Again, we know this only incompletely. Now, Julian Simon, of course, says that there is no problem even if we take out a few species. We do have these genetic banks, and we can, seed banks. We can very easily recreate all these. He's talking about technology, biotechnology, and all that. But Richard Leakey is, I would say, more practical, makes more sense because he says, how can we decide which species have to be or can be eliminated? Because for that, we need complete information about each and every single kind of species and the kind of services that provide, the kind of balance they give to this biota. And we do not know this, he says. And because we do not have complete information, how can we take off? How can we hope to eliminate a species without causing harm to this entire system? So he says the degree of ignorance about the natural world upon which we depend is frustratingly large, but it is not total, as I described in chapter 8. We do know that Homo sapiens is not exempt from the rules that govern the lives of all other organisms. Now he says that it is we are ignorant about the degree of ignorance about the natural world. He says is quite large. It is frustratingly large. And he says, we, the Homo sapiens, we are not an exception. We are part of our natural world, and the rules that apply to all the other organisms, they apply to us as well. So he says that in the face of ignorance about how much of current biodiversity we need in order to sustain a healthy Earth's biota, is it more responsible to say that because we don't know if we need it all, we can assume we don't? We recognize the complexities of the system and assume we do. So he says there are two ways of looking at it. Now he says, um, because we are ignorant, can we say that because we don't know about all the species, we do not know whether one species is more important, and because it is because of our ignorance, let us assume that we don't really need some species. Will that be safe? And what if we say that we understand that the system is very complex and we need it? Now, he says that the answer is obvious because the cost of being wrong on the first count are enormous. There are two ways of looking at it. We can be overly cautious. We can say that we do not know, let's preserve each and every single species. Now that is one extreme. The other extreme is because we don't know about all the species, we do not know whether we need all of them, we can safely assume that we may not need all of them, and then we can do away with some of the species. But he says, what if we are wrong? What if we are wrong and we kill off a species that are very important to human life? And we do it because of our ignorance. So he says, in any case, many ecologists, extrapolating from the incomplete knowledge they have about the structure and the dynamics of ecosystem services, believe that we do need all or at least most of what we currently have. So now he says most of the ecologists would agree, would estimate that because we have an incomplete knowledge about the dynamics of ecosystem services, most of the ecologists would agree that we would need all or most of all the species that we have right now. Through continued destruction of biodiversity, in through the continued destruction of biodiversity in the wake of economic development, we could push the natural world over a threshold beyond which it might be unable to sustain first itself and ultimately us. So he says that if we continue with this destruction of biodiversity because we want economic development, we could be pushing this natural world into a sort of a crisis, over a threshold. And if we push the natural world over, if we push this natural world over a threshold, it will be very difficult. It will be impossible for us to come back, regain ourselves, and then that would ultimately affect us as well because we are part of the system. So he says, unrestrained, Homo sapiens might not only be the agents of sixth extinction, but also risk being one of the victims. So when we manipulate, exploit nature, when we kill off species for our own economic gain, what we fail to realize is that we are actually the harbingers, or I would say we are the agents. We are the ones who are actually creating the sixth extinction. We are the agents of sixth extinction, but what we fail to realize is that we are also going to be its victims. We are going to be victims of the sixth extinction as well. He says we are living. Humans live in the present. We look at the world around us and find it difficult to encompass change over great tracts of time. So he says, we as a species, we are living in the present and we look at the world around us, and what is impossible for us to understand is great periods of time. Now, when I say great periods of time, I'm talking about in terms of centuries, or when we say billions and billions of years, we do not think about time in that expansive mode. We talk about in like a decade, maybe a century, or that's all. But the perspective of time is important if we are fully to understand the biological processes we are driving by our actions. And of course, to see where our future as a species lies, we must therefore turn to the fossil record of life. For it alone can inform us of the dynamics of living systems at time scales beyond our current experience and imagination. So he says, we do not realize that we are actually going to create the sixth extinction, and we are going to be agents as well as victims. Now he says the problem with us is that we think of time only in the present. We only think about the present period. Now, if we need to understand the threat, we have to really revalue this time, re-evaluate this time period. Let us go back in time. Let us understand this world through a different perspective. He says, for this, we have to turn to our fossil records, because only if we look back in time do we understand what could happen in future. Now this is the perspective of time. Now we only think about this particular period. We do not think about sixth extinction. We are not worried about extinction because we always think about the present. What we need to do is we need to really see time from a different angle altogether. We have to make it more expansive. We have to understand the income, or understand the changes over great tracts of time. Now he says, let us look into these fossil records, because the fossils would tell us what has happened, and it will also inform us of the dynamics of the living systems at time scales beyond our current experience and imagination. So this is what we need to have. We need to do, that is understand time from a different time scale altogether. So now when you look at the time scale, we also understand about the other mass extinctions and the fact that um, Earth has died before and it is not a new idea at all. So these are the other extinctions, and these are some of the ideas regarding these extinctions. So this is what we are facing right now, the sixth extinction. So now this is the first message of fossil records. The most immediate message of the record about the history of life is that major catastrophic collapses of biological diversity can and do occur. So the first message of this fossil, first message of fossils is the fact that major catastrophic collapses of biological diversity has happened and will occur in future as well. Moreover, these crises in life's flow can be rapid, irreversible, and unpredictable. So the first message of fossil records tell us certain truths. The fact that, yes, the collapse of biological diversity can happen and it has happened. The fact that this crisis in life can be very rapid, and once it happens it is irreversible, and at the same time it is unpredictable. We never know what is going to happen and when it is going to happen. So now this should press home to us an important insight into the natural world of which we are a part. Species and communities of species are not infinitely resilient to external insult, meaning you cannot keep on harming a particular species without doing harm to it, without external insult. They are not infinitely resilient, meaning they are not invincible, and very soon they may go extinct. They are vulnerable and they can disappear and be lost forever. So when we exploit a species, whether it is a flora or fauna, we have to understand that they are not going to continually uh, give us resources. If we keep exploiting them, at a moment, at a point in time, they are going to go extinct. They are vulnerable and they can disappear and be lost forever. Now, we acknowledge that mass extinctions can be precipitated by Earth's impact with extraterrestrial objects and by global changes of various kinds, but do not see ourselves as potential agents in such biological crisis. Now, he says that, Richard Leakey says that we always think of um, extinction. When we think about extinction, Earth's extinction, or something that does damage to Earth, we think about extraterrestrial objects like asteroids and meteors and other global changes. But we never see ourselves as such a threat. We do not see ourselves as agents or threats to Earth. So that is something else that he says that we need to understand, that we are potential agents in crisis. So the daily cutting of tropical forests, so deforestation, encroachment on wild habitats is less dramatic process than asteroid impact, but in the end the effect is the same. So now he brings together two ideas. For example, when we think about asteroid, when the asteroid hits a planet, within an instant everything changes. Destruction happens in an instant. But he says daily cutting of tropical forest encroachment on wild habitats may not be sudden, may not destroy the planet all at once in an instant, but it takes time, but the process may be different, but the end result is the same. Whether you're cutting down trees or whether the asteroid comes and hits the earth, the end effect is the same, and that is destruction of the planet. So he says very subtly, indirectly, insidiously, mass extinction is occurring because of human action. He says mass extinction is occurring. It is happening right now. As we speak, it is happening. With cutting of tropical forest, with pollution, it is slowly happening. In pursuing our own ends, because we live for our, we want creature comfort, we want to live comfortably, we treat the world of nature as if it can withstand each of our assaults without harm, but we do so at our peril. We believe that this entire planet was only made for us, and we assume that we can keep on taking from this planet and nothing will happen to it. But that is a folly. That is a folly, because we may not be asteroids, we may not be meteors, but by harming nature, we are slowly killing the planet. We may not be quickly killing a planet like an asteroid or a meteor, but we are slowly killing it. And this is the proof that we get from the fossil records. The fossil records show us that life has not been a static phenomenon through Earth's history, but rather is a dynamic process. Now, there's something else that the fossil records tell us, that life is never static. It keeps on changing. It is a dynamic process. Neither is it a steady progression, but rather it is a dynamic process. So you find, but rather it is punctuated by mass killings, the victims of which, whether we are looking at individual species or groups of species or ecosystems, are gone forever. So the death of species is a termination of a continuous chain of genetic links that reach back billions of years. A unique genetic package vanishes from the Earth's variety for good. Each time human action results in the extirpation of a species, that is, the total destruction of a species, collectively, each of us bears a part of the responsibility for snuffing out a unique part of life forever. I take this responsibility very seriously. So he says that we are responsible for the destruction of species, and he says there is no other way but to admit for such a crime, because whether it is one species or a group of species, but whether it is just one or many, what we have to admit is that when we kill or when a particular species dies off, you find that there is this, a link, or it's like a chain. There is a chain of connection, and when one species is, cut off or it goes extinct, there is a break in the chain of links, and this biodiversity is always affected. And when the death of the species also terminates this link that has been, a continuation from billions of years, and you find that this genetic package, once it vanishes from the earth, it vanishes for good. We can never bring it back. And he says this is a crime and this is a responsibility that we have to admit. We have to take this responsibility for killing of species. But report, but report the anti-alarmist. Look at the fossil record again, and you will see the species' lives are limited anyway, lasting between 1 and 10 million years on average. Now, he says, but you know what? The anti-alarmists, they will never They will never allow or they will never support such a claim because they don't believe in saving species. Because according to them, they believe that each species, they have a limited lifespan, and because they have a limited lifespan, what is the point? If a species can only live for 10 years, what is so wrong if they die after 5 years? That is the kind of attitude that they have. That is the anti-alarmists like Julian Simon, because they don't give any importance to the life of these species. So they would probably say that species' lives are limited to 1 and 10 million years on average. So, what is the point? The longer lived species are among the less conspicuous creatures of our world. Those with shorter lifespans are the larger creatures, such as terrestrial vertebrates. For example, larger creatures live for shorter period, and the really insignificant, small, conspicuous or less conspicuous creatures, they live in our world for a longer period. He says some species end their tenure in the steady grind of background extinction, others in the cataclysmic mass dyings. So some species, they would die out eventually due to extinction, and the others would of course die in some kind of mass dying. Now it is with this perspective that the anti-alarmists, they say that saving species is a waste of time. They don't believe in wasting the time, effort, and money, because for them, that is what matters: the present moment and money. Because after all, they say that these species are going to die. So, what is wrong if they die a little bit sooner than later? So, with this perspective, say the anti alarmist attempts to save the species may be wasting time, effort, and money, because they will disappear over time regardless of our effort. Even if we wanted to preserve them after their duration, after their allotted time, they will definitely die. So, if a species, their lifespan is maybe from 1 to 10 million years, then they would definitely die after that. Now, coming to the second major message of the fossil record is that evolution is a wondrously and powerfully creative process, one that rapidly fills the void left after each mass extinction. After all, the diversity of life in recent times is at an all-time high, the result of repeated bounce backs after five major biological crises and more than a dozen smaller ones. Often, the beginning of new species after extinction events involves a transformation of the dominant form of life. We are in the age of mammals, which came into being after the demise of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And in this new age, primates have become the most extensively endowed mentally, with Homo sapiens at the top of the heap or the food chain. So now he says the second message of the fossil records is that evolution occurs, and evolution is a very creative process, and evolution happens whether we like it or not. And the best example are the so-called the five major extinctions that have happened in the past. Now after each extinction, you find that nature has always come back, not simply come back, but they've come back, they've bounced back, and you find nature looks much better. So after each coming back, after each extinction, you find nature revives, it transforms itself, and now we are at the age of mammals. We replace the age of dinosaurs, and in this period, you find after the demise of dinosaurs, primates have become the most important species. Now, after dinosaurs, human beings or Homo sapiens are now at the top of the food chain. Now, he says the fossil records also hint or also tells us that after the sixth extinction is over, diversity will return, as it always has, assuming, of course, that the agent of destruction, the current behavior of Homo sapiens, passes. And if the past is anything to be to judge by, the diversity of life will be even more extensive than it is now. And who knows what evolutionary novelties may emerge. If nature recovers so boisterously following mass extinctions, then perhaps we shouldn't be concerned about causing one. The answer to this one is that it depends on the time scale you are looking at. So now you also understand that after each crisis, you find nature has always bounced back, and the sixth extinction is not going to be any different. Now, after sixth extinction and after the so-called behavior of humans have passed, you find diversity of life and nature is definitely going to revive. It is going to come back. It's going to bounce back. And after sixth extinction, you find diversity will remain, uh, and you will find that it's going to come up with new evolutionary novelties. So now, if nature recovers or it is always recovered, then maybe we shouldn't worry about causing damage to nature. But then that depends, our point of view would also depend on the time scale you are looking at. Even though mass extinctions are virtually instantaneous, occurring within a matter of years or centuries, in the case of asteroid impact, 2 millennia or a few million years from earthbound causes. Recovery, however, is slow. Yes, nature bounces back. There is recovery. There is beautiful or wonderful evolutionary novelties. You find nature recovers boisterously, but how long does it take for nature to recover? Extinctions happen within an instant, but recovery takes time. Recovery is slow. It lasts between 5 and 25 million years. So that is the difference. So it'll all depend on the perspective and the time scale we are looking at. So it is slow. Slow, that is on human scale. Slow not only in terms of time as we can comprehend it as individuals, but also in terms of the expected tenure of us as a species. There is no reason to think that the 1 to 10 million year average lifespan that applies to other species should not apply to our own. So just like these anti-alarmists who basically gives each species a time period, how can we forget to give ourselves this so-called a time period? So he says, just like the anti-alarmists have given species between 1 and 10 million years on average, you find Homo sapiens to have that lifespan. So there is no reason to think that the 1 to 10 million year average lifespan that applies to other species should not apply to our own. Homo sapiens have been around for 150,000, like a lakh, um, yeah, years. So we might look forward to a further million years or so, unless, of course, our capacity for destruction hastens our end. So we may, if you look at it from that angle, that means we have millions of years to go. But that will all depend on how fast we can destroy our planet. It depends on our capacity for destruction. Moreover, at some point in Earth's future, a giant asteroid or comet will slam into a planet, instantly destroying the majority of species, perhaps including our own. Several small asteroids have passed uncomfortably close in recent years. They are the harbingers, they are the messengers of the inevitable. So these asteroids are, they're carriers, they are messengers, and they keep telling us of the fact that crisis and extinctions are reality. It will happen, if not today, sometime in future. So they are harbingers of the inevitable, which according to some calculations will arrive about 13 million years from now. If by an unusual chance the descendants of Homo sapiens still thrive on Earth at that time, the aftermath of the impact would surely extirpate, that is, destroy most, if not all, of their populations. And even if some do survive the initial impact, civilization would certainly be shattered, perhaps never recover. If there is one certainty that we can derive from an understanding of life's flow and the forces that shape it, it is that one day we and our descendants will be no more, and the earth and its inhabitants will go on without us. So that is one thing that we can be sure about, and that is that you have to understand the life's flow and the fact that one day in future, maybe in the distant future, we will no longer be there in this planet, and earth and all the other inhabitants of the planet will continue without us. Once our time is up, we will not be here, but earth will continue. Now, many people find it impossible to contemplate a time when Homo sapiens would no longer exist. So they like to assume that we will break the biological rule and continue forever, or at least until our planet ceases to exist. Billions of years from now, when its atmosphere is burnt off by an expanding sun. Now, some believe, like Julian Simon, so I believe that Leakey is basically trying to mock and make fun of Julian Simon, and he says that some people they believe that human race will exist forever. Julian Simon obviously believes so when he talks of our capacity to thrive for the next 7 billion years. So Julian Simon is a person who seems to be extremely optimistic, because he says that the human race will be able to live happily for the next 7 billion years. He is blind to reality. He is blind to reality. There are those who cling to the idea that we can escape this end too by recourse to space travel and colonization of other planets, in which case it matters little what damage we inflict on one planet we know can support us. So there are others who believe that we can continue to live, and we can survive. If not in this planet, we can um, travel in space and find other planets, colonize other planets from other solar systems, go and stay somewhere else. And such people don't really believe that it is, they believe that it's okay to destroy the planet that we have right now, because we can always recourse to space travel and stay in some other planet. So now both are flights of fancy. People who believe that we can go and live in other planets, and people like Julian Simon who believe that human race will exist forever, both are flights of fancy, born of the arrogant belief that Homo sapiens is separate from and above the rest of the world of nature, and a belief in our invincibility. Now, Richard Leakey says that both these ideas are completely imaginative. They are extremely imaginative and false, because it is only of arrogance. It's because they are very proud that they believe that humans are invincible, they cannot be destroyed. If we learn anything from the scrutiny of life's history and the dynamics by which species thrive collectively, we learn that neither is true. I could argue, as others have, that we owe it to ourselves, to our children, and to our children's children not to foul our nest. So now he says that we have learned from ourselves, we have learned, uh, we owe it to our children and our children's children not to destroy our planet, because we need to keep our planet ready for our children, and we are not supposed to, destroy, degrade the diversity of life upon which we depend for our survival. If you look at the animal kingdom, you do not see birds fouling, destroying their nest. They treat it, they value their nest, they keep it intact. That is a kind of mentality that we need to have. We should not destroy our nest, that is our planet. So now here he moves on to the next argument. He says that as one sentient creature on earth, meaning we are the only ones to perceive or feel things. So we are the most intelligent race. So we owe it to this planet to protect the lives of all of Earth's species. I could argue, as others have, that all the species with which we share the world today have an absolute right to our protection because they exist. So it is our duty to protect the other species, because we are one sentient creature, and if that is the reality, then we owe it to the entire planet to protect it. So we have a duty to protect the lives of all the earth species. I could argue, as others have, that all the species with which we share the world today have an absolute right to our protection simply because they exist. Each of these exhortations, that is, urgings, is valid, and separately or collectively, they represent an imperative. It is a necessity, it is an urgency to recognize our role in the sixth extinction and to stop the insidious, that is, the subtle or indirect mass destruction that is soon to push 100 species a day, 4 species an hour, into evolutionary oblivion. He says it is critical for us to reevaluate our position and do something about the destruction that we are doing. He says each day you find we push 100 species into existence, and each hour at least 4 species they go into extinction. So we have to do something about it. But I want to add a further imperative. So he's urging, he says, one that derives from the perspective of the history of life of Earth, not as earlier from a human centered view, but from the view of the rest of nature species. So he wants us to change our perspective, view Earth not from a human centered view, but look at the Earth, look at our planet from the viewpoint of all the other species. So this is the final plea that he has.